Can trade policies become the ultimate weapon in modern global warfare? Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Commute Commentary, where we look past the narrative to cut through regional bias. Today we are diving into the escalating tensions between Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi over Russian crude oil.
Yeah, and it is an incredibly complex situation right now.
It really is. I mean, imagine parking this massive, rusting supertanker in the dead of night, right? Somewhere off the coast of Greece, the crew is like scrambling across the deck to paint over the ship's name.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they deliberately disable the GPS transponder so the vessel just, vanishes from maritime tracking screens.
Just completely off the grid.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then they secretly transfer millions of barrels of crude oil to another waiting ship before setting a course for Mumbai.
Which is just a remarkably risky maneuver.
It is. But that high-stakes maneuver is just one small piece of the reality of this so-called shadow fleet operating on our oceans today. So, today's mission for our deep dive is to unpack a massive bipartisan U.S. Senate bill. It's called the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2026.
Right. And we really need to examine the global ripple effects this is creating, across Asia, Europe, and even the domestic political arena within the U.S.
Absolutely. We're looking at a huge stack of geopolitical analyses, economic reports, and international statements. Just to remind you, our listener, we always keep our sources neutral and anonymous.
Yeah, we just want to give you a completely neutral 360-degree view of what is rapidly becoming, quite frankly, a high-stakes global standoff.
So let's get into it. This bill, it represents a pretty fascinating shift in global trade dynamics, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at a piece of legislation that was heavily championed by the late U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, and it actually recently secured the backing of President Donald Trump.
Okay, so heavy hitters behind it.
Yeah, and when you read through the source documents, it becomes clear this isn't just like a subtle policy tweak. It's not a minor adjustment.
Right, it's a lot bigger than that.
It is a profound reimagining of how the United States utilizes its economic leverage. They're essentially weaponizing access to the U.S. consumer market to enforce foreign policy objectives.
And it's a strategy that relies on incredibly blunt instruments, honestly. Let's look at the actual blueprint of this bill because the mechanics are, they're unprecedented.
They really are. At its core, the bill grants the U.S. president the authority to impose some incredibly severe penalties on nations that are still buying Russian energy.
We're talking about giving the executive branch the unilateral power to slap up to 100% tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. from those specific countries.
Yeah, a full 100%. And the targeting mechanism is highly specific. It focuses entirely on the top 5 buyers of Russian energy.
Okay, so who exactly is on that list?
Well, if we break it down by the type of energy, for crude oil, the top 5 targeted nations are China, India, Slovakia, Hungary, and Azerbaijan.
Wow, that list alone covers a massive portion of the Eurasian continent. I mean, those are some of the largest consumer economies on Earth.
Exactly. But then you have the natural gas side, which brings in a totally different set of geopolitical players.
Right, the gas importers. Who are they?
For natural gas, the top 5 importers targeted by the legislation are China, France, Japan, Hungary, and Belgium.
Wait, France and Japan are on there too?
Yep. And if a country lands on either of those lists, the legislation authorizes that massive 100% tariff on the goods they export to the U.S.
So we are talking about effectively doubling the import cost of electronics, vehicles, raw materials, just everything from some of the biggest manufacturing hubs on the planet.
Basically, yes. It fundamentally rewrites the rules of engagement for international trade.
That is wild. And, thinking about how massive that penalty is brings to mind a bit of trivia about how this legislation evolved. I have a question for our audience. Do you know what was the maximum tariff percentage originally proposed in the first draft of the bill? If you know the answer, drop it in the comments below. We will be pinning the best explanation.
It's definitely a fascinating piece of the backstory.
Right. But regardless of where it started, sitting at this current cap of 100% is just astronomical.
It's a staggering figure. And the geopolitical analysts we are sourcing note that the bill goes far beyond just these secondary tariffs, too.
Really? What else is in there?
It's structured as a comprehensive package of economic restrictions. It's designed to isolate an entire ecosystem. So it includes full blocking sanctions on Russia's energy and financial sectors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and more interestingly, it specifically targets that shadow fleet you mentioned in the introduction.
I find the mechanics of that shadow fleet so fascinating. I mean, how do you actually legislate against a ship that technically doesn't exist on paper?
That is the big question, right?
Yeah, because from what I was reading in the maritime shipping reports, these vessels engage in constant flag hopping. Like, they might register in Liberia one month, switch to the Marshall Islands the next.
Exactly. And they use what is called AIS spoofing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Manipulating their automatic identification system. They make it look like they are docked in West Africa when they are actually loading crude in the Baltic Sea.
Right. So that is a massive operational challenge. To combat that, this bill goes after the critical infrastructure that allows those ships to dock at any legitimate port in the first place, the maritime insurance providers.
Ah, so going after the money.
Exactly. Without P&I protection and indemnity insurance, a ship is just a massive liability. The legislation targets any financial or insurance entity providing cover for these ghost ships.
That makes a lot of sense.
And furthermore, the bill extends its reach to any foreign entities collaborating with Russia's defense industrial base. The reports highlight that this specifically includes nations like Iran.
So they're aiming to cut off the supply chains providing drones and military hardware, right?
Yeah, by targeting the financial institutions facilitating those specific trades.
Got it. Well, let's transition to the underlying economic logic driving all of this, because it's not just about broad punishment. The supporters of this bill are operating on a very specific, almost clinical macroeconomic theory.
They are. They're relying heavily on the fundamental principles of marginal science.
Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean in this context?
So, proponents are looking closely at the relationship between marginal cost, which is the expense required to extract and transport one additional barrel of crude oil, and marginal revenue, which is the money Russia earns from selling that specific barrel on the global market.
So the idea being that as long as the revenue is even slightly higher than the cost, the producers will just keep pumping.
Exactly. But the goal here is to compress the price buyers are willing to pay by threatening them with these massive secondary tariffs. You want to drive that marginal revenue down so far that it falls below the average variable cost of production. This forces the industry into what economists call the shutdown point.
And hitting that shutdown point in the energy sector is incredibly severe, isn't it? It's not like closing a retail store where you just lock the doors and turn off the lights.
Oh no. It is an entirely different scale of economic damage.
Right. I mean, think about heavy industry. If you are operating a massive oil well in the Siberian permafrost in the dead of winter, you can't just flip a switch and pause operations for a few months.
Right, because the ambient temperature is, 40 degrees below zero?
Exactly. If the heated fluids stop moving through that infrastructure, the pipes freeze, the water and oil separate and expand, and the well casing literally physically shatters.
Wow. So you just lose that capital investment forever.
Yeah, so hitting the shutdown point doesn't just pause the Russian economy, it permanently damages their extraction capabilities.
And that structural vulnerability is exactly what the proponents of this bill are trying to exploit. They want to make it physically and financially impossible for the energy sector to maintain its operations.
And, some of the commentators backing this theory use incredibly passionate, frankly aggressive rhetoric to describe this strategy.
They really do.
Yeah, I was reading through our sources, and one economic analyst fiercely argued that the ultimate design of this bill is to destroy this Russia in order to create a peaceful, better state.
That is pretty intense wording.
It is. They leaned into a physics metaphor, comparing the inevitable collapse of the Russian economy to dropping a heavy rock and watching gravity pull it down, insisting that market forces make this total economic collapse an absolute certainty if the tariffs are applied.
That is their specific perspective. We do not endorse or validate that stance.
Absolutely. We're just reporting what the sources say.
Right. But if we look at the structural economics behind that claim, however, it relies on the assumption that the global market will behave predictably.
Which is where I have to push back on that gravity analogy, honestly, because the global oil market is famously fungible.
By fungible, you mean interchangeable, right?
Yes, exactly. A barrel of crude is largely interchangeable. If you take a barrel of Russian Ural crude and a barrel of Saudi crude and put them in a massive storage tank in Rotterdam, they blend together. Oil is oil.
That's a great point.
So if India and China are forced by these U.S. tariffs to suddenly stop buying those 3 or 4 million barrels a day of Russian crude, someone else is going to step in to buy it at a massive discount.
Oh, no, certainly.
Or if that oil truly gets trapped and comes off the market entirely, won't that sudden massive supply shock just drive up the global price of oil for everyone else, including American consumers?
And you've just articulated the primary counter-argument raised by global energy analysts. The laws of supply and demand are absolute.
Right.
If you abruptly remove millions of barrels from the daily global supply, the price of the remaining available oil will skyrocket.
Because the global energy market is a deeply interconnected web.
Exactly. A supply shock localized in Eurasia reverberates instantly to the gas pumps in Los Angeles and the manufacturing plants in Berlin.
And that domestic fear of an inflationary wave is exactly what's driving the pushback inside the U.S. Capitol, isn't it? Because looking at the political analysis, this bill does not have a unified front in Washington.
Far from it. The domestic pushback is significant. And what really stands out in the reporting is how remarkably bipartisan the opposition has become.
Which you don't see very often these days.
No, you don't. Lawmakers are scrutinizing the actual mechanics of the bill and sounding the alarm about the concentration of power it represents.
Yeah, we are seeing critics like Democratic Senator Ron Wyden and Representative Richard Meeks stepping forward with serious concerns.
Right. They are warning that this legislation eventually outsources massive trade and tariff power to what they describe as a runaway executive.
A runaway executive? That's a strong phrase.
It is. They fear it gives the president far too much latitude to interpret vague national security criteria and apply 100% tariffs without any built-in congressional mechanism to disapprove or reverse those taxes once they're rolling.
It touches on a very old foundational tension in American constitutional politics, doesn't it? Like regarding who actually controls international trade.
Exactly. Historically, the legislative branch, Congress, holds the power of the purse and the power to regulate foreign commerce.
But over the past few decades, Congress has increasingly delegated that authority to the executive branch through various national security exemptions.
Right. And critics argue this bill pushes that delegation to a dangerous extreme. They share the exact same concern you raised earlier about inelastic supply chains.
The inflation risk.
Yes. If the executive branch slaps a 100% tariff on goods coming from China and India, which are the massive foundational suppliers of everyday products to the United States, who actually pays that tax?
Well, the exporting country doesn't pay it. The American importer pays the tariff at the port, and they immediately pass that cost onto the everyday American consumer.
Which threatens to spark a massive inflationary wave right at home, effectively taxing the domestic population to achieve a foreign policy goal.
And that domestic inflation fear connects perfectly to the global blowback we are seeing, especially from the Asian giants, because they know exactly how much leverage they hold over global supply chains.
They certainly do.
Let's look at Beijing's reaction first. According to the diplomatic reports, China's foreign ministry strongly opposes this bill. They're officially accusing the United States of double standards and coercion.
Beijing's stance is deeply rooted in their interpretation of international law.
How so?
Well, their core argument is that these unilateral U.S. secondary sanctions are completely illegal because they bypass the United Nations Security Council.
Oh.
In the traditional international framework, global sanctions require a UN mandate. But because Russia holds veto power on the Security Council, the U.S. circumvents the UN and instead leverages the dominance of the U.S. dollar and the Western financial system to enforce compliance globally.
Which China views as the weaponization of a shared financial ecosystem.
Exactly.
The Chinese government has been very clear that they view this as a gross overreach of domestic U.S. law into international waters, and they have vowed to take all necessary measures to defend their businesses.
And, the historical context here is really vital.
Right, because Washington and Beijing recently signed a framework to ease trade tensions after a bruising multi-year trade war where we saw tariffs flying back and forth, like up to 145% from the U.S. and 125% from China.
Yeah, so introducing a new sweeping 100% tariff threat right now disrupts an incredibly fragile economic detente.
It certainly does. But the diplomatic calculus becomes even more complex when we look at New Delhi.
Oh, absolutely. India finds itself navigating an incredibly precarious geopolitical position right now.
Trying to balance strategic partnerships with urgent domestic economic needs.
Right. Just to give you an idea of the scale, economic reports indicate that as of July, India relies on Russia for over half of its total crude oil imports. It's hovering around 2.6 million barrels a day.
Wow, 2.6 million a day. And the timing of this U.S. sanctions bill colliding with India's economic reality is highly volatile. Washington and New Delhi are currently in the middle of delicate bilateral trade negotiations, right?
Yes, they are attempting to finalize a broad agreement before an existing 10% U.S. tariff on Indian exports expires.
And that expiring tariff is just one layer of the friction. The reports highlight that New Delhi is currently fighting off existing U.S. trade probes, specifically Section 301 investigations.
That's right.
Let's pause on that for a second because that term gets thrown around a lot in trade reports. What exactly is a Section 301 investigation in practical terms?
So Section 301 is a statute under the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. It essentially allows the U.S. government to investigate foreign trade practices that it deems unfair or discriminatory to U.S. commerce. Crucially, if the investigation finds fault, it grants the executive branch the authority to unilaterally impose trade sanctions or tariffs without waiting for the World Trade Organization to authorize them.
Got it. And currently, the U.S. is using Section 301 to probe Indian labor practices and their massive production capacity.
Exactly. So New Delhi is already in a defensive posture, pushing back against these unilateral U.S. probes.
And now, into that highly tense negotiating room, Washington introduces the threat of a massive 100% tariff over Indian purchases of Russian oil. The diplomatic leverage being applied here is immense.
It forces India into an incredibly difficult corner, because from a purely macroeconomic perspective, New Delhi simply cannot afford to walk away from that Russian energy.
Why is that?
India's reliance on this heavily discounted crude is a cornerstone of their current economic stability. Purchasing oil below global market rates allows the Indian government to actively suppress domestic inflation.
Which is absolutely vital for a rapidly developing economy managing a population of over 1 billion people.
Yeah.
But here is where the mechanics of the global oil market get truly ironic, and it goes back to our earlier discussion about fungibility. India isn't just burning this oil domestically, are they?
No, they are not.
This massive influx of cheap Russian crude allows Indian refiners to maintain incredibly high utilization rates. They take that discounted Russian crude, refine it into high-grade diesel, gasoline, and aviation fuel at massive facilities like Jamnagar,
Right.
and then they export those refined products back to tight energy markets in the West.
Including directly to Europe and the United States.
It is wild to think about. The US and Europe are still heavily reliant on energy derived from Russian oil. It has just been practically laundered through an Indian refinery first.
It perfectly illustrates the inescapable reality of the global supply chain. Energy analysts emphasize that if the U.S. were to somehow successfully force India to stop buying that 2.6 million barrels a day, there is simply not enough alternative refining capacity globally to replace that volume of diesel and gasoline reliably.
So if you cut off India's access to the raw material, you inevitably constrict the refined fuel supply for the entire Western world.
Exactly. The consequences would ripple far beyond India's borders, likely triggering the exact inflation spikes American lawmakers are trying to avoid.
Wow. So Washington is pushing incredibly hard with this legislative threat. Beijing is citing international law and threatening retaliation. And New Delhi is trying to maintain its economic lifeline without triggering a trade war. How is the Kremlin reacting to this massive, coordinated legislative threat aimed directly at their primary revenue source?
Well, based on public statements from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, Moscow is playing it very cool.
Really, just ignoring it.
They are adopting a strict wait-and-see approach. The official line is that the Kremlin is calmly listening, recording, and analyzing the statements coming from Washington and from President Trump regarding this bill.
Which makes pragmatic sense, I suppose. Drafting a severe piece of legislation in the U.S. Senate and actually enforcing a 100% tariff on the world's largest economies are two vastly different things.
Right. The Kremlin knows that Western domestic politics might do the work of killing the bill for them.
That's a great point. And speaking of the internal contradictions of this legislation, we have to talk about the European carve-out buried in the text.
Ah, yes. The exemption clause is a critical piece of the puzzle.
It really is. I mean, we just spent all this time discussing how Asian buyers like China and India are facing this massive 100% tariff cliff for buying Russian energy.
Yep.
But the bill actually features a built-in exemption for countries that import less than 15% of Russia's natural gas and can prove they are actively taking steps to reduce that dependence.
And if we connect this specific clause to the broader geopolitical strategy, the exemption is highly revealing. It operates as a protective economic shield specifically designed for U.S. allies in Europe and Asia.
Interesting.
Yeah, if you look at the energy consumption data, countries like France, Belgium, and Japan currently fall safely under this 15% exemption umbrella.
So it's not a blind blanket ban on everyone interacting with Russian energy. It's a highly targeted weapon.
Exactly. It reveals that the legislative authors in the U.S. are attempting to surgically target geopolitical adversaries, or at least the nations they feel are actively enabling Russia's economy.
While protecting their friends.
Yes, without accidentally plunging their own close allies into a severe cascading energy crisis. Think about the economic fallout. If a key ally like Japan or France were suddenly hit with 100% tariffs on all their exports to the U.S.
It would instantly devastate allied economies and likely fracture the Western alliance entirely.
So the 15% threshold is the calculated political compromise required to keep the alliance intact while still attempting to project overwhelming economic power globally.
It's a stark reminder that in the realm of global economics, policies are rarely ever one-size-fits-all. Beneath the bold headlines of 100% tariffs, there are always negotiated exemptions, complex legal loopholes, and massive unintended consequences. We started this deep dive looking at the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2026 as a new tool of modern warfare. And what the source material has shown us is an incredibly tangled, fragile web. You pull one string in Washington hoping to cut off revenue in Moscow, and you might end up causing an inflation spike in your own grocery stores or severely destabilizing a strategic partner's economy in Asia.
It perfectly illustrates both the theoretical limits and the very real-world dangers of using unilateral trade policy to attempt to solve multilateral, deeply entrenched geopolitical conflicts.
It's time to leave our beloved audience with a question. Who ultimately pays the price for 100% tariffs? The targeted government or the everyday consumer and business? Share your views on this in the comments section. And that wraps up our discussion for today. Browse our show for more global insights, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next shift. See you next time on the Commute Commentary.